Greetings. This lecture is on compensation and base pay. Typically, when we pay people, there's multiple dimensions of pay. This particular lecture deals with the first aspect of pay, which is when we determine what the salary should be for a particular position. This has nothing to do with incentives or raises or bonuses, but is clearly focused on the value of a particular job and how much we should pay someone to do the work of that particular job. So as you go to the Human Resource Management System model, you'll see in the implementation box in the lower left-hand corner is compensation, and that's where we start to determine the basics of compensation and who should be paid what. Next slide, as I said, addresses the issues of what are the kinds of things that go into compensation. And total compensation includes multiple dimensions of things. It includes the base pay for the job itself. It includes pay for performance, which are incentives and bonuses and merit increases. And then the last thing is indirect pay or benefits. And so your total compensation package isn't just about what your salary is, but it also includes your pay and your benefits and any kind of raises or bonuses that come along with it. The nice thing about compensation is that it isn't always financial. A lot of times we can give non-financial benefits like days off, and it's not a cost to someone, but it sort of gives them, they get to earn money without having to necessarily do the job. So there's some advantages to doing those kinds of things, and people like days off, so of course that's always a good thing for them. So total compensation is multidimensional, and we always want to make sure that we're addressing all those dimensions of things. One of the most important laws that we need to deal with is the Fair Labor Standards Act. And the Fair Labor Standards Act, it basically argues a few things. Number one, it determines who is exempt and who is non-exempt from overtime. And people who do not get overtime are things like professionals, like doctors and lawyers and things like that, administrative professionals, administrative individuals, people who are administrating or managing departments and things like that. Managers don't get it. Executives don't get overtime because they're already paid a large enough salary to accommodate all the hours that they need to work. And outside sales reps don't get it because basically the job of the outside sales rep is to be able to make commissions based on the number of sales that they have. So they're expected to do the work in order to make the sale. In terms of overtime, what is overtime? It's 1.5 times whatever your hourly rate is. Even if you're paid a salary, if you are non-exempt, that means you earn overtime, and so you can calculate what someone's hourly rate is if you know how many hours a week they work, and you know what their annual salary is and how many weeks work they work, and do they get paid for lunchtime or not get paid for lunchtime, do they get a paid vacation or an unpaid vacation, those sorts of things. Typically it's 1.5 times your standard hourly wage anytime over 40 hours. In terms of minimum wage legislation, the federal minimum wage is currently $7.25 an hour, and this was as of 2009, but it's important to know that state and local municipalities can set their own minimum wages. And in fact, in the state of Missouri, the state tried to create legislation saying that local municipalities could not have a higher minimum wage than the state minimum, and the courts found that to be illegal. So, for example, the city of St. Louis can have a higher minimum wage than, say, the state overall, or even higher than maybe Springfield, Missouri. So state and local municipalities can certainly set whatever salary minimum wage rates that they want to. The last thing is child labor restrictions, and as you know, people are not allowed to work under a certain age, and the most important thing is that we're following those rules. Anybody under a certain age can't work. Anyone between the ages of 16 and 18 can work certain types of jobs as long as they're not dangerous jobs. And anything over 18, people can engage in more dangerous work, assuming that they have been trained to do so. Your next slide is talking about how do we set up our pay policies. One of the most important things that we need to do is set up a consistent internally consistent pay policy, which means lower paid jobs have a lower value to the company, higher paid jobs have higher value to the company, and we want to make sure that the compensable factors of the job are in alignment with what people are getting paid. So if someone has a really highly important job but they're not getting paid a lot, that's not very internally consistent. And if they have a really unimportant job but are getting paid a lot of money, that's also not internally consistent. And our goal is to set up a really fair system of compensation. So when we get into class, I'll talk a little bit about what does it mean, what does it visually mean in order to have a fair compensation system. In order to do that, we have to start with job analysis, of course. We want to make sure we've got our job descriptions. Then we, from the job descriptions, we evaluate the worth of each job, and we basically look at the things that are called the compensable factors. And those compensable factors include things like how difficult the job is, how much effort is required to do the job, how dirty the working conditions are, those kind of working conditions. So there's a whole lot of different things that we can evaluate in terms of those kind of compensable factors. And there's money attached to each compensable factor, and as those compensable factors add up, we also have higher cost to do a particular job. Different ways that we can do job evaluation is we assign a value to the salary for each, for the value, a dollar value to each job. A ranking method is a simple method where we compare jobs to each other, and it's a non-quantitative method of ranking the value of those jobs. And the slide after this gives you a good example of what a job ranking looks like, which I'll describe in a moment. Another method is job classification, where we use narratives to describe jobs, and then we vary those narratives based on a certain standard, and then we compare everybody to that written narrative standard. The next one is a factor comparison, where we break the job down into sub-factors. So I might have a job that has multiple different aspects to it, and each one of those aspects has a different value and a different comparison, a quantitative value. So we assign a value to each of those sub-factors, and we can calculate an appropriate wage. And then lastly, we can do what we call as the point method. It's a much more complex system where we have factors and sub-factors. We compare people against standards. We have point values attached to each substandard and each subcategory, so that basically we get to a point where you can look at a big sheet and then you can just circle, how you would describe the work that these people do, and if it's at a certain level and there's a certain descriptor and that matches what they do, you circle the point values attached to that, and ultimately you can add up all your points to come up with the value of the job. So let me just show you the next 4 slides fairly quickly, and we can review these in class. Job ranking method is where we compare all the jobs in the columns with the jobs in the rows, and if the job in the row is more important than the column, we would get a point. And what we notice is, for example, the mailroom clerk. It doesn't have any X's anywhere, which basically means it's the least important job in the company. And then we move to the data processing manager, and we notice pretty much in every column, except for where it's being compared against itself, there's an X in the column, which means the job in the row is more important than the job in the column. So you add up all those points and you notice there's 9 points. So we know the most important job and we know the least important job. And then we have to sort of calculate where everybody else fits in, and that's where we compare every job against every other job to see how they would rank out. And then ultimately we add up the numbers, and it tells us the ranking of those value of the jobs themselves. So which one's the highest value, which one's the lowest value. The problem with this system is that it really doesn't describe how much more important one job is than another. It just says it's more important. The other aspect that's interesting and important to note is that job ranking is appropriate to use, but it really is not appropriate for larger organizations to use them, because larger organizations have way too many jobs to put into a job ranking matrix. So smaller companies or smaller departments tend to use these job ranking methods particularly when they have a handful of very diverse jobs, and it's really hard to quantify, what each one does and how much better any one would be than another. So we use the ranking method to give us a general sense of how much more, how much money each job should make. And of course, we want to go to our surveys and things like that in order to be able to get that information and move on from there. The job classification, if you recall, I said there was a narrative description of what each standard was, and what we do is we read the description and see if it matches what we expect, and then we then evaluate the job based on whether or not it fits those standards, and then we assign dollar values to each of those standards in order to determine what each job is then worth. The factor comparison is where we look at each job and then we break down into different compensable factors. We rank then the jobs based on those compensable factors, for example, mental requirements, skill requirements, physical requirements, responsibility, and working conditions, and then we rank them from lowest to highest. The highest mental requirement is for the pattern maker. The lowest mental requirement is for the rammer. The highest skill requirement is for the pattern maker, and the lowest skill requirement is for the laborer. The highest physical requirement is for the rammer. The lowest physical requirement is the substation operator. Highest responsibility is substation operator. They're obviously running an important station, and it may have some difficult challenges, but the lowest responsibility is the laborer. They're the lowest on the totem pole. Working conditions, the rammer has the most difficult. The last one is our point method, and each job would get a form like this where I would go in and I would say, this job of secretary has a certain amount of skill, certain amount of education requirements, and I would circle the values attached to each factor, subfactor, and a level of difficulty, which is the levels of degrees, and I would circle what would be appropriate based on the descriptions, and then I would add up all the points, and I would come up with something between 0 and 600. 600 in this situation being the highest points you could earn. And this is typically a method that's used in larger organizations because they have the money and the resources behind them to actually do a really good solid point method analysis. Again, as compared to a job ranking where usually smaller organizations have to do that because it's just too onerous and too expensive to do the point method. As smaller businesses, it's easy to differentiate people based on rankings as opposed to these more elaborate point systems, because point systems are expensive to do. And if you only have 10 people, you don't really need to have an elaborate point system to get a better sense of who is or more or less important than the other. And here's a great example of what we want our internal work structure to look like, which means along the x-axis, which is across the bottom, is all the point values for the particular job. So it might rank between 0 and 600 as we were looking at in our examples. And then the dollar sign on the y-axis represents the amount of money we pay per hour or per median rate for the work that people do. And so higher paid individuals should be paid more for their efforts, and typically they have higher points, which means that the jobs are more valuable. And then we have jobs that are lower in points will be paid lower money, and that's how we want to basically set that up. After you've determined your internal equity, the next thing we need to really focus on is external equity and making sure that our labor market surveys are giving us information about what's going on in terms of local pay and general pay. We want to compare my internal job points to external wage rates, and so I want to look at what other companies are ranking their jobs at and what these job values are at. Then I'm going to apply those to my own company, and then I turn around and then make a determination based on labor market surveys what should be the pay rate for these particular jobs based on market competitiveness. And then when we set our pay line, and we'll talk again about this a little bit in class, we set our pay line so that it leads, lags, or matches. And the whole idea is that we want to be able to lead the market. If we are a differentiation strategy company, we lead the pack in terms of the kind of pay and benefits that we give, so we're always in the high end, and then the rest of the market lags behind us in terms of the pay rates. If we are a a low-cost strategy company, we're going to more likely lag the market or match it. And, we're going to definitely be behind. We're not going to be paying top dollar, so we're going to be on the lower end of the scale in terms of our pay. Next thing we want to talk about is pay ranges, and each job has a pay range. Typically, each of these pay grades give us a sense of what the minimum and maximum pay would be for jobs in those particular categories. And these categories have jobs that are very similar in terms of their skill and compensable factors. So each pay grade goes up, and as you develop more and more pay grades, you create what we call a pay structure. And the pay structure can be based on the value of jobs or the value of the skills associated with a particular job. And so if a job has a particular skill and someone develops more skills, they should be able to make more and more money, attached to that. Job banding is where we take these smaller pay grades and very complex structures, and we broaden them out to be one giant band of pay. And again, this is something I'll probably be able to better illustrate in class, but what we have is larger pay grades, and the goal of these larger pay grades is because it gives us a lot more flexibility to work around the pay grades. We can give people pay raises without necessarily having to give them requisite promotions to go along with it. And it enables us to give more pay and benefits to people even if we don't have opportunities to promote them. So these would be good things to do. Lastly, is a good example of a strategic use of pay ranges, and we typically can use our pay ranges for one of three reasons. We can use it to reward them for good performance, and so they will get a raise on their increase in their base pay based on how well they perform on the job. So this is part of that evaluative performance appraisal. What we do is we give them more money based on how well they're performing on the job, and we can move them up through that pay range as they improve and they are better performers. And they might start at the very bottom as entry-level workers, and over time they may get more and more pay based on that. Another way we can use this pay range is for promotions, is for pay increases based on seniority. So as someone is there the first 6 months, they get a quick bonus, and then they're there another 6 months, they get another bonus, and then every year after that for a few years, they'll get a raise that's sort of, usually as part of a union agreement, increases their pay, regularly. The last thing you could do is one that measures both performance and membership. You can give people a raise for a few years just for staying. So you give them some pay based on seniority and their willingness to stay with the company for a few years. And then once they hit a certain midpoint and they have high quality abilities, then the goal is that we want to then switch to rewarding them for performance. And so we're including longevity and as well as performance, because we believe that those two ideas go hand in hand. So that's the basics on compensation. I'll talk more about some of these more specific issues in class, and I'll talk to you later. Bye.